I'm NIMA Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Violence continues for a third week in Sudan. However, the army and a rival paramilitary faction have agreed to extend a shaky humanitarian ceasefire by another 72 hours. Meanwhile, Canada is relocating its efforts to get stranded Canadians out of the East African country. The change in escape routes from Sudan's main airport in the capital to a distant port city comes amid deteriorating security conditions. Rescue operations in Sudan continue to be impacted by intense fighting. However, there are on-the-ground rescues happening with the help of veteran-led nonprofit organizations. Well, joining us now to give us the latest updates on what's happening in Sudan amid efforts to rescue stranded North Americans is Mr. Brian Stern. He is a combat veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and founder and CEO of Project DYNAMO, a veteran-led nonprofit international search and rescue organization. He joins us today from Egypt. Mr. Stern, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks for having us. I appreciate it.
Now, you currently have a team on the ground in Sudan. So what have you been hearing from them regarding the situation in the country amid this fragile ceasefire?
Well, we're a donor-funded organization. We just did the first rescue of Americans by air in the history of this war. The U.S. military has been doing boats primarily, and some ground convoys, but we've been doing ground convoys, and we did the first air operation this morning, rescuing over 80 Americans to Egypt, to Cairo, Egypt. The situation on the ground is deteriorating rapidly. This is the civil war is the worst kind of war to have. Both sides are heavily armed. There's a lot of foreign influence on both sides, and both sides know the streets. And war is always terrible in Africa. So I predict this getting a lot worse before it gets better.
And can you tell us where your team is situated amid this escalating violence in key cities like the capital of Khartoum and Darfur?
We have people all over the place, but concentrated in Khartoum and Port Sudan.
All right. And how's your team conducting these evacuations? You mentioned air evacuations, but flights out of the Khartoum airport have ended. So is this primarily through Port Sudan? Is your team utilizing other airports? Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so we just did our first one. It's the first one of the war for the Americans. It was a charter aircraft into Port Sudan. So we did buses from Khartoum to Port Sudan, and then charter aircraft, which is also a first of this war, out of Port Sudan to Cairo. The plane originated in Doha, went from Doha to Port Sudan across. Along the way, one of our buses was attacked by the RSF, where they were robbed. They stole their phones and their money and all their personal effects, and kind of left them to die on the road. So they survived, thank God, but very complicated, very, very, very complicated.
Thank goodness they did survive. So how many people have you been able to rescue so far?
So our philosophy is to go from the hot zone to the warm zone to the cold zone. So basically where there's active fighting with people getting shot in the streets, to a warm zone where it's still potentially risky, but significantly safer, to a cold zone where it is truly safe. So what that looks like is going from Khartoum to Port Sudan to Egypt in this case. We did almost 90 yesterday, which is almost the size of the U.S. embassy that was evacuated, if you think about it. And we've done about double that by ground, from hot zone to warm zone to Port Sudan.
And has your team been in contact with any Canadian presence in the region? Can you update us on the rescue operations of Canadians in particular, by any chance?
Yeah, we're international, so I'm happy to evacuate Canadians. I think I need to check, but I think we did some Canadians on our in fact, I know we did Canadians on our buses. We did not do Canadians on the flight today for some reason. I think they got out through the Canadian military by air, through the Canadian forces.
All right. So what do we know so far about the Sudanese who are to be left behind amid this violence? How do you see things playing out from your experience?
I think it's going to be pretty terrible. This is the third war zone that DYNAMO is active in. First, Afghanistan, where we're still active. We just did an operation there yesterday, pardon me. We are still active in Ukraine and Russia, and now here. So I think this is going to play out terrible. War is always bad. Armies fight each other. That's what they do. Politicians kill each other. That's what they do. But the people that pay the highest price are the civilians in the middle. And that's really who DYNAMO seeks to serve. This is why we're raising money. ProjectDynamo.org is my website. every dollar goes to an operation. These people will die if they are stuck there. It's just a fact. So without government help and foreign help and NGO help like Project Dynamo, these people really don't have a lifeline to get out of the way of the armies that are killing each other.
All right, Mr. Stern, thank you again for your time today and the important work that you and your team are doing. Thank you. Communities and organizations across the country are marking Mental Health Week, with this year's theme being My Story. According to the Canadian Mental Health Association, this year's Mental Health Week aims to shed light on mental health care champions, programs, and communities, while also advocating for a universal mental health care plan for Canada. And the CMHA isn't alone in its push for a universal mental health care plan. A recent survey conducted by the organization finds that 87% of respondents also agree with this sentiment. And out of the 35% of respondents who experienced a mental health-related concern in the past year, over one-third did not have access to help. Now, this was because it was too expensive or hard to find. Well, joining us now to talk more about this year's Mental Health Week is Ms. Margaret Eden, National CEO of the Canadian Mental Health Association. Ms. Eden, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what would you say are the main takeaways from this research for policymakers, and how does this year's theme of My Story tie in to this latest study?
Well, we've been very concerned, especially since the pandemic, that many Canadians are suffering. We know that at least 20% of the population will experience a mental health disorder in any given year. But because of COVID and because of the economy right now, we know even more people are suffering through mental health challenges, and children are particularly affected. So we would very much like to see more investment in universal mental health care, which basically means you could use your provincial health card to go and get the care that you need, when you need it, where you need it.
And we know this year there's a strong focus on community-based supports and frontline workers. So what have you been hearing from community-based organizations and frontline workers when it comes to the demand and as well as the capacity for mental health services amid all this need?
Well, we have CMHAs, Canadian Mental Health Associations, in 330 regions across the country. And we know that the phones have been ringing off the hook. Many of our programs have long waiting lists, and we don't feel like we have the resources to actually support the Canadians who call us in dire need of help. And this is for things like substance use health, eating disorders, peer support groups, counseling and psychotherapy, all of the things that Canadians need for their better mental health, but can't seem to access.
So how important is affordability and access when it comes to addressing what many are calling a mental health crisis in our country?
Yes, our survey found that 69% of people living in Canada believe it's a crisis. But what we also found, as you noted, is that when people go to look for care, they either can't afford it or they can't find it. So if you think about it, something like psychotherapy can cost hundreds of dollars an hour. If you have an employee healthcare program, you may be able to access some supports, but many people don't have that kind of support. And we're particularly concerned about people who are marginalized, people with disability, the LGBTQ community. These are folks who experience greater mental health care needs, but also cannot often afford the care. And we know if you live in certain parts of the country, you're not going to be able to find that care. So if you live in the north, if you're in a rural community, it can be that much harder to find the care that you need.
And especially if you're living in the north or a rural community, community-based programs are key here. That's what the CMHA is highlighting. So what would a community-based program nationally look like ideally?
Well, we would really like to see a model like in the United Kingdom, where if you're suffering from anxiety or depression, you can go to your local health center and get free care. Usually it's cognitive behavioral therapy and access to psychotherapy, which is really the gold standard for care for these kind of issues. Right now, we don't have that kind of accessibility and care in Canada. So we look to the United Kingdom and the European Union as real models for how universal mental health care could actually work.
It's clear that a lot of steps need to be taken. Just about a minute left here, Ms. Eaton, but what kind of supports are currently available for Canadians experiencing mental health concerns? And more importantly, how can they get access to them?
Well, right now, Canada is spending about 7% of its healthcare budget on mental health. We would like to see it go to about 13%. But in that 7%, there is support through community organizations. So we encourage you to visit cmha.ca to find a local healthcare organization in your community that can help. And if you're suffering, we also suggest wellnesstogether.ca, which is a federal government program that actually offers a couple of free hours of psychotherapy. It's not enough for most people, but it will get you started.
Not enough, but enough to get you started. Again, Ms. Eaton, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily for this important conversation.
Thank you so much.
So don't go anywhere. Forum Daily Week in Review will be right back after these messages. Efforts to craft a Canadian grocery code of conduct have reached a major milestone as Canada prepares to roll out a grocery rebate as well. The industry committee working on the grocery code was established in response to contentious fees being charged to suppliers by large grocery retailers. A proposed final version includes a process to resolve disputes and impose sanctions on systemic violators of the code. Meanwhile, a grocery rebate plan has been proposed in the Senate, which would likely see the bill receive royal assent by May 12th. The Cost of Living Relief Act No. 3 passed its second reading in the Senate on Wednesday. But will these measures be enough to help inflation hit Canadians with their rising grocery bills? Well, joining us now to unpack these efforts is Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, a food expert and professor at Dalhousie University. Dr. Charlebois, welcome back to Forum Daily.
My pleasure.
So, sir, let's start with this grocery code of conduct, hoping to address these contentious fees being charged by grocers to suppliers. So what do we know about the stipulations in this latest proposed version of the code and whether they are enough to support suppliers in this situation?
Well, the code will be industry-led, so that's certainly a concern for processors. We've had some concerns with grocers. Grocers are quite powerful within the supply chain. They do impose fees at the last minute and change terms, contractual terms, sometimes overnight. And so obviously, it's been a concern for both processors and independent grocers who have much less power. We've seen many independent grocers disappear across the country and giving fewer retail options to consumers. And when that happens, well, prices tend to go up. So obviously, you want a forceful code of conduct to make sure that prices don't go up as quickly as what we've seen in recent months.
And your concerns echo the concerns of other critics. Now, they're saying the scales may not be even when it comes to suppliers versus grocers, and some are also pointing to the language in this code. As you say, they may have stopped short on imposing fines on those who fail to adhere to the rules. So can you tell us a little bit more about the consequences that grocers or suppliers may face under this code and whether it's enough?
Well, that's the issue about an industry-led code. I mean, the question is, would Walmart pay a fine if it is charged a fine? At the end of the day, my guess is probably going to be no, and that's a problem. So you really need a code to impose more discipline across the supply chain. Something that we're seeing right now in the United Kingdom, where they were looking at similar problems just a few years ago, and they've resolved many of them. Right now, practices have changed. Grocers are expecting vendors to fund and support financially key strategic initiatives like building warehouses and support an e-commerce strategy. Those things weren't happening about a decade ago. So there is some abuse in the system. And that abuse is not necessarily seen or perceived by consumers, but it is impacting them indirectly.
From the sounds of it, there's still a lot of work to be done, Dr. Charlebois. Just about 2 minutes left here, so I really want to jump to this grocery rebate in Bill C-46. What exactly would it look like for Canadians and who would qualify?
Well, according to some numbers that we've looked at, 11 million people would qualify for this enhanced GST rebate. Let's call it what it is. They call it a grocery rebate to politicize the issue of food inflation, which is really the wrong thing to do. When you politicize food inflation, you come up with very short-term solutions that don't really help Canadians over the long term. And so the grocery code of conduct is certainly one thing that needs to happen over the long term. We need more investments in ag and processing to increase capacity overall and become less vulnerable to currency fluctuations and what happens elsewhere around the world when it comes to climate change. Those are the things that will actually matter to Canadians over time. The grocery rebate will only help a few for maybe just a week or two, and that's about it.
Clearly, there seems to be a lot that needs to be done in the grocery sector, Dr. Charlebois. But for those who may be waiting for this grocery rebate, we mentioned that this bill might get a royal assent by May 12th. When can they expect to see something like the grocery rebate in their bank accounts?
It won't take long. I mean, it's probably going to be executed within a few weeks. So that's good news for people who need it. But my recommendation to Ottawa would be to start looking at long-term solutions like food stamps, for example, similar to what we're seeing right now in the U.S. Basically, you give money only to be used at grocery stores. Right now, the money sent out to people, they can do whatever they want with it. It doesn't mean it will actually be helpful. And that's something we need to think about. And of course, with food stamps, you can actually direct spending and encourage people to buy local foods made in Canada. That's another thing that we should be thinking about.
Alberta is officially gearing up for a provincial election on May 29th, but the race effectively began weeks ago. This with both Danielle Smith's United Conservatives and Rachel Notley's New Democrats warning of a dystopian future if the other should win. Polls suggest that the battleground for the May 29th vote is clearly defined. UCP supporters seem generally focused on the economy and money issues. NDP supporters seem focused more on health, education, and social programs. Well, joining us now to unpack the upcoming election and what's at stake for Alberta voters is Dr. Jeffrey Hale, a political scientist and professor at the University of Lethbridge. Dr. Hale, welcome to Forum Daily.
Good to have you. Good to be here.
Now, recent polls indicate that the Alberta UCP and NDP are locked in a dead heat or very close to it. But what kind of trends have you been seeing so far, while considering that it is quite early in this race?
This is certainly expected to be a very close race. The small town Alberta is by and large Conservative. Edmonton is overwhelmingly NDP. And it's expected that the race will be decided in 10 to 15 seats in suburban Edmonton and around the city of Calgary.
And we know campaigning began even before the writ was dropped on Monday. So how does that set the tone and pace for the weeks ahead?
Well, candidates, especially in close ridings, have been door knocking for up to a couple of months at least, some for longer. Each party has been trying to frame the election in its terms. So the Conservatives, both by using their incumbency to advance various policy positions and actions on the grounds that this gives Premier Smith the best opportunity to define herself practically for voters, and the New Democrats attacking what this and the previous Kenney government have done, as well as trying to discredit Premier Smith for all the comments she made during her leadership candidacy and her years as a talk show host. So the campaign has been going for some while.
And we know Calgary is a key city that both leaders are eyeing. It's being called the real battleground here, as you mentioned. So where do the parties stand when it comes to one of the largest cities in the province?
Well, each party is framing Calgary issues in its own broader context. So the UCP is emphasizing its investments in infrastructure. It's emphasizing the money it has put into hospital expansion and other public services in the university through its infrastructure programs. And it's emphasizing job creation and job diversification and economic diversification, appealing to supporters largely in the private sector. The NDs, the New Democrats, are promoting the funding expansion for public services, especially healthcare, which is a front of mind issue after the pandemic, particularly given frequent doctor shortages, not just in small town and rural Alberta, but also in larger centers. and more investment in education. And they're also talking about putting money into the conversion of downtown office buildings in Calgary, which have huge vacancy rates, partly as a reflection of the downturn in the oil sector in the last decade, partly as a reflection of commuting or working from home during the pandemic. And so these are two different approaches that play to each party's emphasis or view of the public interest.
And on that note, as you mentioned, both parties seem to be very close in this race. However, they're both focused on very different issues for Albertans. So what does this say about the overall sentiment being felt in Alberta amid this race? Just about a minute left here.
There is no single overall sentiment. There are multiple constituencies. Some are torn between respective fears of each party or each leader. Some are oriented towards more basic and more persistent interests, so whether on the public sector or the private sector. And some are ideologically driven, which often overlaps with interests. So I don't think we have one set of elections. I think we have multiple local and sector-driven elections, and the party that manages to navigate these differences most effectively will come out victorious at the other end.
Very tight race, lots to keep our eyes on. Again, Dr. Hale, thank you again for joining us on Forum Daily.
My pleasure.
All right, I'm NIMA Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media accounts. We're available on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter for updates. All right, thanks for joining us on Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again next time.